license.
Thank you. Two presentations. I walk around a lot and I move it by my hands, but I've been fiddling with my presentation until this morning, and I really need my notes in order to know what I have to say. So I'm going to stand here. Can I read my papers? So the organizer said to me that I had complete artistic freedom regarding content and format of this presentation. I'm going to use that artistic freedom completely, probably only to prove that I don't have any artistic talent, but that's up to you to decide. I just want to say that this presentation is in my own name. I'm not representing my organization. I removed the logo and all that stuff, so I'm not representing the Belgian government either, although we're a government. This said, in these kind of international exchanges, we often talk about the technical details of what we do in another country and how we do certain things, and then you look into qualification criteria, insurance techniques, legislation and all that stuff. And it's interesting because you could get a lot of inspiration from that, but it's also dangerous because, in my opinion, if you don't look at why we did something, not just what we did and how we did it, but why we did certain things, then you could come to wrong conclusions. Certain solutions look the same, but if you look under the hood and look at why we choose a certain solution, you could come to the conclusion that actually it doesn't fit your situation at all, because you have a different culture, as already mentioned, different labor market, different financial market. So instead of looking too much at the techniques of the technicalities of what we did in Belgium, I'm going to talk about why we did certain things, or at least how I see how things evolved. So it's not like you can pick pension solutions somewhere from the shelf. That doesn't exist. You have to tweak them and you have to make them fit your own country, your own society. And that's something that often goes wrong. Also in my presentations abroad, if you don't mention these context elements, the reasons why, the little tweaks you did, and how you took a generic solution and actually didn't really implement it the way it's normally described in international documents. You did something else under the hood. If you look at the details, then you see actually it works differently. But if you don't have those details, you could come to the conclusion that you actually have a good example that you could use in your country. I will give a good example, I hope a good example of that later on in my presentation. In addition, and was already mentioned, I think, by Ivo, at least, I like to think that he said the same thing as I did, is that even the very notion of pension could be different. We could both say we have a second pillar pension, but if we don't mean the same by the word pension, we only have this resemblance of agreement between the two of us, or the room and me, the two of us. But in fact, there is a big difference. And even within one country, pension could mean something differently. I think the student of Yves did a doctoral thesis on the concept of pension in Belgium, and at least in the last 100 years yet, at least 7 or 11, I don't stop counting, different pension concepts. Every legislation has another way of defining pension, not always explicitly in the law, but there are some assumptions behind the law that you're actually talking about something completely different. So I will talk also a lot of the why and the context of the Belgian occupational pension system. A remark on terminology. If I say supplementary pension, complementary pension, occupational pension, or second pillar, it's all the same. Perhaps it's from an academical point of view, that's rubbish, but when I use those terms, it's all the same. My presentation consists of 4 parts. So I will start with the obligatory part and explaining what we do in Belgium. It's only 2 slides, and then you have the whole second pillar pension in Belgium. Then I will get to how did we get there? Why did we do all those things? And also the question, did we actually get there? Did we achieve what we thought we were doing when we were installing a second pillar? Then I will add, but that's a very personal choice, 2 current trends in thinking, I called it, in Belgian second pillars, things I see evolving in the upcoming years. And then I will ignore that you actually cannot learn a lot from other countries, and I will give you some lessons learned. So I will go against my own advice, but you will probably, or you don't have the choice, but I wanted to say you will forgive me. But as said, you don't have the choice. I talk, you listen. So the way the second pillar is organized in Belgium, Belgium is one of those countries that still makes a difference between employees, self-employed, and civil servants. We do that in the first pillar. You have 3 different first pillar pension regimes for those 3 professional groups. And this is one of the few points where there is a similarity between the first and the second pillar in Belgium. So also in the second pillar, we distinguish between self-employed second pillar and employee second pillar. There's no second pillar for the civil servants, and I will come to that later. So the second pillar for the employees, it's tripartite, but not in the sense that was used earlier. It's tripartite in the sense that you need to have 3 parties. You need to have a sponsor, the one who pays for the pension, the one who benefits from the pension, which is usually the employee, of course, in employee schemes, which we call the affiliate. He's affiliated to a pension scheme. And you need to have a pension provider. There's a link with the question, can an employer take money back out of the system? No, you can't. You need to put the money with a third party, that's the pension provider. And in Belgium, that's an insurer or a pension fund, IORP. The sponsor is usually the employer, but you can also have this on an industry level, like the construction industry, the metal industry, the textile industry. They can organize or sponsor second pillar pensions at that level. In that case, those are the social parties who already have their gremia for negotiation. They can decide to start a second pillar, and then it covers the whole industry. It's possible to make some exemptions, but normally, if you have an industry level second pillar pension scheme, every employer in that industry branch has to participate, and every employee that is working in that industry branch will be affiliated to the industry level scheme. So that looks a lot like mandatory, but it's mandatory when the social partners decide to make it mandatory. Otherwise, it's a complete discretion of the employer or the sponsor or the industry level to start a second pillar or not. And complete discretion means the sponsor decides everything. Do I start a second pillar? How much do I pay in my second pillar? What's the wage base I use to calculate the contributions? Is it a DB, a DC, a cash balance system? Everything is decided by the sponsor. He also decides who can benefit from the pension scheme. He could actually say certain employees in my company can get that second pillar, others can't. But there are some limits to how far you can go. So he is limited by certain non-discrimination rules. You cannot just be very arbitrary and the group of people I like can get a second pillar and the other ones can't. You have to be some objective criterion to distinguish between categories of employees, and that's getting more and more limited. The possibilities you have in Belgium, it's getting more and more limited by jurisprudence and by there's a lot of contestation. If someone doesn't get one, then probably that group of employees will claim that it's discriminatory. But in theory, you could define different groups, and you could also give different kind of second pillar pensions to those different groups within the same company. There are also social protection rules you have to respect, and that will limit how far your freedom goes as an employer. First of all, the right should be vested. That means that if you give something, it should be something that becomes, I'm not going to use the word property, but it becomes a claim of the employee. It's not something you can take back, like, oh, you didn't work that well this year, so I take back what I promised to give you. No, it needs to be definitive. If you give 3% of the salary, money should be put with an insurer or a pension fund, and you cannot take it back. This is, I will come back to how we got to this point, but that's a quite important rule. And there is also, these are the two most important, in my opinion, most important social protection rules. There's also a minimum return rate. That means that if you put money into a pension system, you should, as a sponsor, guarantee that the lifelong course of the pension, there should be a certain return. Not that you put money in it and in the end you get less out of it, or you don't even get, or you get just 0%, you just get your money back. No, there should be a certain return that's guaranteed. Normally, the fund will make sure that with the investments there is this return. The insurer will guarantee a certain return, but there is this extra layer that if all those things don't work out the way they should be, then the employer has to make sure that what you get out of it is the equivalent of what you paid into it, plus a certain guaranteed return. That actually makes most pension schemes in Belgium actually DB schemes. because it's not just paying money in it and see what comes out. That would be a DC scheme. Because if you have to pay money into it and you have to guarantee a certain result that is expressed as a certain return on the money you put into it, actually it turns, I think most employers manage to convince their accountant that it's still a DC scheme, but you could argue that it's a DB scheme and you should make provisions in your budget to cover a DB scheme responsibility. Externalization, as I said, is mandatory. That's why it's tripartite. We had some book reserves, so I just promise you that I will pay you something in addition when you take up your pension. And a prudent employer would put that in his books, like I have this obligation that's still open, I will pay it in the future. But of course, if your employer goes bankrupt, your promises disappears too. So that's another layer of protection. The money should be externalized, so you're protected against the risk of bankruptcy of your sponsor. If the sponsor is an employer or it's the industry, you have this protection of externalization. We still have some historical book reserves because we do a lot of what Yves talked about, a lot of transition rules and a lot of rules of slowly changing from one system to another. That's one of the reasons why we still have book reserves. And it's fiscally stimulated. That's the question on how does the government participate in it. That's not what I meant when I talked about tripartite, but in that sense, you could see it also as tripartite. It's fiscally stimulated. You get a tax deduction in your as a sponsor. You get a tax deduction for what you pay into the second pillar. We don't have the one euro rule. Most schemes in Belgium don't have employee contribution. If I would take the majority, that doesn't mean that it's only marginal that it happens that there is an employee contribution. It's just not what happens in most schemes. Most schemes are only funded by the sponsor and via the fiscal stimulation also by the state. The 80% rule, that's the reason why civil servants don't get a second pillar. The 80% rule is a rule that says whatever you pay into a second pillar, you can deduct it from your taxes as a sponsor, but only if the resulting pension, together with the first pillar pension, is not more than 80% of your end salary. Well, it's a big challenge to calculate that 40 years long during a lifetime, what the result will be in 40 years and what your salary will be in 40 years. So there are a lot of interpretation rules and it doesn't work very well in Belgium, but that's the idea. We stimulate it fiscally, but only up to a certain limit. We're not going to fiscally subsidize pensions that are 300% of the last salary. It should be limited to 80%. And what's the link now with the civil servants? The civil servants in Belgium have a DB first pillar scheme of 75% of their final salary. It's becoming less and less generous in Belgium. It's now that it was the 5 last years, the average wage of the 5 last years. Now it's the 10 last years, but still, it's a DB scheme that's related to plus or minus your end salary. And the idea was, if the civil servants get something that generous, we should, for all the others, make it possible to have the same first and second pillar combined. So the inspiration of the 80% is actually based on a rule in the first pillar we have for civil servants. Sounds complex, and it is complex, at least in the way we try to implement it. I said there are 2 asterisks, tripartite, and it's the employer. Well, because the European Commission was pushing personal pension products, we did something too. We had a liberal center-right government a couple of years ago, and they said, no, that's the future. We should have personal private pension products. We installed that too in Belgium, so an employee can now decide himself. I take a second pillar. It actually resembles a third pillar, but it's called a second pillar. And it's such a huge success that I looked up the numbers. I think we had 400 people doing that, and now, okay, we reached 1,074 people on a population of 11 million. So I would call that a huge policy success. There are some reasons for that. But then we have to go into how it's commercialized by insurers, how it's fiscally treated, but there's very little appetite in Belgium to have individual second pillar pension products for employees. We all those who can afford it have a third pillar, but in the second pillar, it doesn't take off. Now, if you look at the self-employed, it actually is basically the same, but of course you don't have an employer. So the sponsor is the self-employed person himself. He chooses which pension fund or which mainly insurer he takes as a pension provider. He also decides how much he puts into that system. He pays it, of course. There are some limits on how much money you can put into the system. That's several second pillar schemes for employees. Some are limited with a maximum amount, others are proportional, like the 80% rule. But in general, pretty much the same. It needs to be externalized. You pay into it, you get a tax deduction. That's a subsidy that the state puts into your system. And you decide what kind of product, but of course you cannot choose products that are not offered by the market. So in most cases, it's just, or in all cases, just a DC scheme. It could become tripartite if you have a company, management company, for instance. Then the management company could play the role of sponsor. It's actually the self-employed saying, my company should give money. Or if it's a group of self-employed who are co-managing the company, they actually decide that their company should give them an occupational pension or a second pillar. So it becomes tripartite, but it's a bit artificial. From a legal point of view, you could distinguish the insured, so the affiliate who is a self-employed manager. You have the sponsor, which is his management company, and you have the external insurer who manages the product. But it's highly artificial in my opinion. But basically, the rules are the same. Now, we didn't get there all at once. This is my interpretation of what the situation was before. I'm not making it, it's like a very bleak description of the situation before we had legislation or the most recent legislation. That's not to make it sound better what we had afterwards, because we have a lot of problems with the new legislations. But mainly before, we had a situation where the second pillar was something that employers gave to the people they liked. So actually it was the management giving themselves via their employer an occupational pension. It was limited to the top tier in most cases, usually very generous pension schemes, which is possible if you only have a limited group to cover. It was very often very discretionary gift of the employer, which he also could take back. So there was no vested rights, or not always vested rights. There was not always an externalization. That was a situation beforehand. And it was also a way of, and that still is, of fiscally and parafiscally, so that's social contributions, optimizing the remuneration package of your managers and your top tier employees. And the perception of it was that it's either the companies that had the idea of, we need to take care of our employees also in the future, and they were offering generous DB schemes that were paid as annuities. But in a lot of cases, it was just money that was available for the person who was benefiting from it, and he could take up for investments, for asset schemes, for buying property, we're investing in property. So it was just a financial asset next to a lot of other financial assets that a person could have. And it was not really a pension, of course. It was not paid in lump sums in those cases. It was no longevity protection, no inflation protection. It was just money that was there at the disposal of those who were happy enough to benefit from it. It's, in reality, was much more nuanced, but that was the main drivers, in my opinion, behind second pillar beforehand. And what's beforehand? That's, let's say, end of the 90s, early 2000s, it started to change. And why did it start to change? That's not just something that happened at that moment. There was a debate starting. The unequal access, the fact that it was a privilege for the few and not for the many, was starting to be discussed. And the ones who discussed it the first were just those below the top tier, of course. So you had top management and middle management start claiming the same thing, and then it went down into all the companies to the bottom tier, and even the blue-collar workers started at a certain moment claiming they needed to have a second pillar too. And the labor unions were a bit ambivalent on that, because officially, and I think some of them still do, they oppose the second pillar because it's seen as a threat to Social Security. And to some extent, I think they could make an argument, a point. But also, but in reality, on the work floor, they really did negotiate where they could additional advantages, as is their role, additional advantages for also blue-collar workers. On a more societal level, there was full-blown aging discussion that was started by academics, but also by politicians. All of a sudden, pensions were a big problem. The first pillar was going bankrupt. There was no money to pay for the first pillar. Reforms were needed. It was becoming too expensive, and we have been talking about reforms ever since. That's now almost 35 years ago, and we're still talking about urgent reforms that are needed. And at the same time, they said the solution for all these problems is for the second pillar. Second pillar has never funding problems. They live in a completely different economical environment. So if there's no money for pensions, you could solve it with pensions, but you have to call them second pillar pensions. All of a sudden, there's money. It will solve the replacement rate problem. It will solve the budgetary problem of the first pillar. So that was the situation. And then the conclusion was, on a political level, so let's organize this better. If everybody wants a second pillar and if the second pillar is actually really going to solve all our problems, let's make a legal framework for these second pillar plans. And that's where, from that period, that's 2005, 2004, 1995, 2004, we saw a lot of legislation that is still the framework we have now 20 years later. Actually, we celebrated this year the 20th anniversary of the second pillar law for employees, which is, let's say, the reference law or the basic law for what we do in second pillars in Belgium. And that's where all the non-discrimination rules come from. So that this evolution we saw, this is actually an advantage for the privileged, and we really would like to have second pillar pensions not for the few and the happy, but for the many. So that's partly solved by introducing non-discrimination legislation. Individual schemes are still possible. You can still give advantages to certain employees you like better than the others, but you first need to have a broad coverage for the general population in your company. So these are all rules that should help to broaden the coverage and to make it a coverage for more people than just the top tier in your company. We had a legal framework, and that turned out to be very important in Belgium, a legal framework for collective bargaining on second pillar pensions. I will show you the numbers afterwards. That was probably the most impact that law had on second pillars in Belgium. We also organized, it's actually Yves and Paul who wrote a big part of the law. We created a framework for industry-wide negotiations and industry-wide schemes. As I said, the whole protection against employer discretion by vested rights, the protection against default by externalization, it all comes from that period. Some words on the guaranteed minimum return. I already talked about it, and that seems like, if you look at it from an economical point of view, and if you see how insurances and investments work, then that's completely stupid. Because the more, as Yves or Joanna said, the more guarantees you want, the lesser the return will be. So if you don't look under the hood of why we have that, then you would say, oh, that's a stupid thing. So I learned something, I should not do this, for instance. That could be one of the conclusions. But what you're actually saying is, if you're introducing this on a big scale and you want to convince employees, white collar or blue collar employees, to say, well, you could get a pay raise. Guess what? I'm not going to give you the pay raise. I'm going to put this in a second pillar pension. You ask that person to forego a pay raise. He will see the result of that in 40 years, or on average 20 years, depends on when you start the scheme. You don't only ask him to forego a pay raise, but also, that's something we have in Belgium that perhaps helps explain this, we have automatic indexation of wages in Belgium. If there's inflation, wages go up automatically according to inflation. So you not only say you don't get the pay raise, you also don't get all the future indexations of that pay. If I put it in a pension plan and that pension plan is not following inflation, I'm very bad off. Then I could better take the direct pay, because then I have the pay and the indexation of the pay. If I put it just in a pension scheme, I only have the pay. Unless you introduce something like a guaranteed minimum return in the second pillar. Still, the discussion is not closed, and it went from 4.15% to 1.75%. So at the moment, it's below inflation. So it lost its rationale to a big extent. But I just give this example to show that if you look at the system, look also at what's the broader context, and you'll have to look at the broader context of wage policy and labor market in Belgium to understand why we did stupid things like introducing a guaranteed minimum return. By the way, I'm very much in favor of that minimum return guarantee, but that's another thing. Now, of course, we didn't stop evolving in 2004. Some people would probably claim we have stopped evolving, but a lot of things kept moving, but not to the same drastic extent as was the case in 2003. A lot of new additional legislation for subgroups in the professional groups, like we had something for the self-employed, but then the self-employed start comparing them to the self-employed with a management company, and they wanted to do something too, but not creating a management company. So we invented another kind of complementary pension scheme for self-employed, the self-employed without a company. But basically, it's always the same. Just if you start from the complementary pension law for employees, you could easily understand how the other laws look like, or you could easily predict how the other laws would look like or will look like. So every year, every 2 years, there's new sets of legislation, new changes in legislation to tweak and to fine-tune the legislation we also have. But the big framework still dates from 2003, 2004. That's the mechanics of the second pillar. Things moved a lot on what's hanging around that communication about second pillar pensions and transparency about second pillar pensions. We had the introduction 13 years ago, I think, of a second pillar database. In which every second pillar pension that exists in Belgium should be registered. I say should be because if you don't know what's 100%, you don't know if you reach 100%. But we're pretty sure that it's in there, because if you want to benefit from a tax deduction any longer as an employer, you need to register your pension provider needs to register your pension scheme beforehand. So that's one of those new limitations and conditions. So we're sharpening the framework the whole time, making it a bit more transparent, a bit more strict, probably some would say. But the transparency allowed us to have, or the database allowed us to have, a more level playing field in the prudential social control on second pillar pensions. Because beforehand it was just, the insurer says this plan is okay and respects the fiscal limitations, and the fiscal administrations would say, okay, nice. Now they're actually able to check whether it's true, or they should be able to check whether it's true, but I'm not going to go against my colleagues of the financial administration. Not here. Pension tracking platform. So we have mypension.be. Also in Dutch, and in French, it's mypension.be. That's what you have. If you have a bilingual country, you look for a third language to do your website, where everybody can check what his accrued rights are in first and second pillar. First pillar is a pay-as-you-go system, so it's not really accrued, but you have an idea of what your pension buildup is up until a certain point, and it's projected to the age of 65, 66, 67, depending on which age cohort you're in and what your pension age will be. That changed a lot. The transparency on pension schemes, I think it limited the possibility to do, limited the freedom to a certain extent for what you could do as a sponsor or a pension institution, but it standardized a lot, and it made people actually a bit more confident in the second pillar, because you had our government website confirming that they had something, that didn't have to worry anymore whether they would lose sight of a contract they had 10 years ago. So that was a big step. I'm not saying that because I manage or my company manages the central database, but I think in reality it was a big step, and we are now doing the last step. We will stop having pension benefit statements made by pension providers as from 2026. It will all flow via the centralized database, which will also have as a consequence that wherever your pension is managed, whatever your pension provider does, you always get the same uniformized, standardized information via mypension.be. There's also an emerging focus on costs, and most importantly, we are now linking first and second pillar pensions in the payment phase. As you remember beforehand, it was just a financial asset you could take up whenever you wanted. Now we're linking it to actually taking up your pension. So second pillar pension should actually serve as pension income when you take up your pension. Those are the main evolutions we're seeing since then. Now, I cannot help but having the impression that from the start there was something completely wrong in the debate that we had and that created all that legislation. I will go into the numbers immediately, but so remember, the first pillar was in big problems, no money anymore, needed reform. The second pillar was going to solve everything. And I think there was a lot of ideology, contradiction, and counterfactuality in all those statements. I will limit myself to the whole budgetary question. You could also have a debate on, does the second pillar actually help with the replacement rate? But if there is no money for pensions, first of all, for instance, I don't agree with the Netherlands. It's not like they were not able anymore to pay their pensions. They were not willing anymore to pay more for their pensions. The sponsors, the employers, were not willing to pick up the bill of the indexation of the annuities. So basically, it's about how much do you want to pay? As a society, how much do you want to spend on pensions? But it's not like there's a fixed maximum and you have to reform to stay within the limits of that maximum. It's a matter of what are you willing to spend as a society on pension. The only maximum is 100% of your GDP, and even then you can take loans. But that's quite a lot of money, and we're not talking about that amount of money. So you have this assumption about the first pillar that there's a limit to the money you can spend on pensions in the first pillar. Something you don't see for all the other government expenses. You don't see people saying, well, there are more children now and they're studying longer, so we need to reform education. That's not something that's happening. You don't say like more children are born and they stay longer in neonatology, so we have to reform the hospitals. That's this thinking of it's a closed envelope and that's where you have to do it with. And if it doesn't work out, we have to reform or reduce the benefits you get out of a system. It only seems to happen for first pillar pensions. And then you have the second pillar in the same debate. Well, the second pillar needs extension. Well, to my knowledge, a pension costs money, whether it's the first or a second pillar. So you have at the same time claiming there is no money, so we need to reform the first pillar. And we're going to start with the second pillar who will solve all the problems in the same economical and demographical situation. So there's something that isn't working, and we still see it, this cognitive dissonance in the current Belgian coalition that says we now urgently, we say this every 6 months, but we now urgently need a final reform of the pension system because it's broke, there's no money left anymore. And in the next paragraph, but literally the next paragraph says we urgently need to extend the second pillar. Everybody should have at least a minimum is 3% of the wages should go to. This already gives you an indication how low contributions are. We don't even get to 3%, but that was the goal. We calculated that it costs a couple of billion. The same billions that are missing in the first pillar are, according to the government, available for the second pillar. So I think that actually what we are seeing is an ideological debate. It's not an economical or a financial debate, it's ideology. There's a push going on since 20 years, redistribution and social security in the first pillar, in favor of private, personal, commercial market products. That's a real debate. It's not about money. I'm pretty sure it's not about money. And it sounds good, of course, because it sounds like a debate on fiscal austerity and economical sound policy, but in reality, we see a debate that's about reducing costs and spending more in pensions at the same time. So that was a point of frustration. I will come now to the slide because, but it doesn't surprise me. The results are poor in Belgium. After 20 years of second pillar pensions, in general, I'm not very happy with the results. There are some positive things in it. I will pinpoint positive things too. And I think it's not surprising that your results are not what you want if your assumptions are wrong. But I will not start my frustration again, or not the ventilation of my frustration. So 20 years later, we have 4.1 million people that have a second pillar account, at least one. On average, is 1.7. One person with 157 accounts, or people with one account too, but 4.1 million, which is 74% of the population. The labor market at active age, so between, I think it's defined between 15 and 65. Of that population, 74% have a second pillar. Looks quite good for a system that's not mandatory. But almost 50% of the accounts are dormant accounts. So people who have accumulated certain assets, but there's no active funding of that account anymore. So that makes it a bit less positive. And almost half of the 74% are thanks to the industry level schemes. So it's thanks to social partners that half of those who are covered are covered. Without the industry schemes, we would be at 37%. I studied law, I cannot calculate, but I think it's 37%, the half of it. So that's the effect of, that's why I said the framework for negotiation on between social partners on the industry level is probably the single most important part of that legislation, because but now when we look at what we call the depth of the coverage, so we have a broad coverage, a lot of people have an account. The depth is how much is on the account. And then we see that the average vested 24,500. That's not an annuity, that's the average amount that's on the accounts that in Belgium probably will be paid out as a lump sum, because we already have annuities. And you also see that immediately now, we'll come back to the gender inequality. An average man has double of what an average woman has in the second pillar. In addition, there are more men than women with a second pillar. So we have an accumulation of inequalities. Next, 24,500 as an average. Sounds good, but the median is 3,500. So, and we see that everywhere. I'm going to walk around a bit. So, for this age group, so you see, those who say, oh, it's a matter of age, because if you're young, you cannot have a lot. You have to work a long time before you get something out of the second pillar. But even if you look at those who are very close to the pension age, the average is 61,000, which is a bit better than 24,000. But if you have to live with that 20 years long, it's not that much. But the median is around 10,000. So half of the people in this age group have less than 10,000. Half of them have more. So that actually means that if you have a difference between 10,000 and 61,000, there's a lot of inequality hidden behind those numbers.
5 minutes.
So that's will not be enough. So the lunch have to wait. We'll have to wait. If the same with the inequality, this is the distribution. You see on the left side, it's only you can only distinguish the 3 lines because I left out the 100 percentile. On the right side, I added the 100 percentile, and then you have it's like the climate change hockey stick, a flat line, and then it goes up very sharply. That means that almost all the money is situated in the top 100% of the. Numbers of last month, I think. We're the country with, according to OECD, and I think they're mistaken, but we're the country with the lowest pay gap. So the lowest inequality between men and women. So how do you manage to get a very high inequality between men and women in the second pillar pension if you have almost no inequality on the pay? Because it's mainly your wage that defines what you get out of a second pillar. So that means that probably there are other things at play. The second pillar not only reproduces inequality, but makes it much stronger in Belgium. And that, to me, that says that having a second pillar without a good social framework will create end results that are not wished for. So, but I think Belgium actually has a good social framework. So why does it produce with a second pillar with a good social protection framework, with non-discrimination rules, it still results in this high inequality between men and women? And then I think that probably our framework is made for a kind of employee that doesn't really exist anymore, or is at least not the norm on the market. That's made for full-time, lifelong employees. It's not made for people who have part-time work. It's not for people who are in and out the labor market because they take time for parental leave, people who are once and so often in unemployment, who are periods of sickness. So we have a good labor social framework, but for another labor market than the Belgian labor market, or only for a part of the Belgian labor market. And that does mean that was also already anticipating on the lessons learned. Just introducing a pension scheme, a second pillar pension scheme, doesn't solve or doesn't get you the result that you want. You also have to look whether it's tuned for the kind of labor market you have. So we didn't get there all at once. We didn't get there, actually. I will come mainly to the conclusion on this slide. We managed to get a quantitatively broad coverage, which is, once again, cannot repeat that enough. That's due to a big effort of the social partners, but we didn't get to have a qualitative good coverage. The amounts are way too low. And that's basically because what I said in the beginning, it's all about money. You can make all the legislation, you're gonna make all the framework. If there's no money available to put into the system, then it will not work. Or if you're not willing to put the money in the system for all employees and only for some, anyway, it will not work. Some current trends, I will be very short. One way of thinking is now that complementary pensions should actually be complementary and should actually be pensions. Seems a bit obvious, but complementary pensions in Belgium were only complementary in name. It was the whole debate about, oh, this will complement your first pillar and it will restore your replacement rate. Well, in reality, we see it's not happening. It was just a narrative to justify the existing of a system that only benefits the top one. I will be generous, the top 3% of the population. And it's also not a pension what you get out. It's not a pension because it's too low. 3,500 euros or even 10,000 euros for the older people as a median. That means that, okay, you can pay your retirement party and you can invite a bit more people than you had in mind, and then the money is gone. That's your second pillar pension in Belgium for most people. And it's also not a pension from a qualitative point of view. It's a lump sum, it's a low lump sum, it's not indexed, it's no longevity protection, there's no inflation protection. Is that a pension? If you define pension as something that protects you against all those risks, then we don't have a supplementary pension in Belgium. Second debate is all about efficiency. It's not started very much, but with the new legislation on transparency, where there also should be transparency on fees and costs, expect it to become a much more interesting debate. But what's puzzling me is that the only ones in Belgium interested in the cost efficiency of supplementary pensions are the employees. It's the labor unions that are asking for more transparency, knowing that they are mostly the ones who are not paying for it, because it's mostly paid by the employees, but employers don't give fee. There is another debate on return on investment that's on a society level. We had our national court of the National Audit Chamber a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago, said that, well, this policy is not working. All the ideas we had about a broad coverage, a supplement to your first pillar pension, a more democratization of the second pillar would be not anymore for the few, but for the many. This policy is not working. We put a lot of money in as the state in tax subsidies, and it's not giving the results you want. So actually, they're on a much more fundamental level than the first return on investment. That's what's the money I get out of it. The second is actually, should we put money into it? Basically, they're questioning the basis of the second pillar in Belgium as it works now. Of course, they recommended to some changes, so it would work perhaps better and be more equal. So now I will do some things I advise against. Well, I put a really to it because lessons learned are something you say to someone else and you don't learn your own lessons. First of all, second pillar is not a wonder cure. It doesn't solve your financial problem. If you don't have the money as a society, second pillar will not produce money. It will only reuse and do something else with the money that's available. Don't oversell, don't over communicate, don't over promise. So the second pillar will not, you can present it as a a panacea, as a cure for all, as a remedy for all the problems that you first formulated regarding to pensions, but it will not solve all those problems. So be very modest with what you do with a second pillar. And also, markets, as we all know with neoliberalism, don't lead automatically to a better society, and neither will supplementary pensions. Not as such. You need to regulate it. You need to build a framework, and you need social partners to make sure that the framework is used for the employees and the self-employed, and not only for the sponsors, for the pension providers. I'm really not trying to attack the pension providers in my presentation. And third lesson is, the second pillar doesn't exist. You need a second pillar that is suited for your labor market, for your financial market, and for your society. So 3 lessons. It's not a wonder cure. You have to fine-tune it. Secondly, distinguish between the technique and the goal. It's not because you allow pension funds and insurers to be active on the market that you have actually achieved a pension. It's not by regulating financial markets that you have regulated pensions. It's not because you have a pension provider that you actually have a pension that's provided for. These things are completely distinct. You need to distinguish these two. You need to know the regulating of the financial markets and the involvement of pension funds and insurers is a technique to achieve a goal. You need to be clear what your goal is. I think the minister said it. It's like, we want decent pensions. Yeah, that's a very good goal. You have to define what you call decent, but still, it's not because you use a technique like the second pillar that is used to create decent pensions that you will automatically have decent pensions. There's something else. The Belgian case shows that. We have a good framework, but the result is still poor because you need something more than just a good framework. So it's necessary to define what you think a good pension is. What should a pension do? What kind of risk protection should a pension give you? If you think it should protect you against inflation, longevity, the evolution of the economical markets, financial markets, if you want all that, then you will immediately have also the question, who is going to protect who for that risk? What risks are we putting in the basket of the employee? Which risk do we put in the basket of the sponsor? And which risk do we put in the basket of the pension provider or even society? But there's a big link between defining what a decent pension is and this question. And the problem is, it's not neutral. You cannot say, I want a decent pension and all the risks are in the basket of the employee, which is the case in a DC scheme. Because then you end up with something that looks and smells like a pension, but isn't a pension. You just have shifted money around and all the risks are not covered. It's then the responsibility of I'm almost there. Sorry for the time. And now a third lesson learned. I have a fourth one, but it's not on the slide. Trust in the context of uncertainty, that's a difficult thing to deal with. And as Belgo-Mongolian wisdom says that trust comes on foot and leaves on a horse. So it's very slow to gain trust and you lose it very easily. Once you lost it, it doesn't come back very easy. And pensions are the very long game, and so you need to have trust on a couple of levels. You need real stability, so a stable legal financial environment, but you also need to have perceived stability. If you have stability, but it's not perceived as being a stable environment, then you probably will lose trust. Now, pensions deal by nature with things that are unknown. They deal with the future. And I'm not talking about the evident future like demography and like longevity and things like that. The future, and all these elements are relevant for pensions too, is also what's happening in Ukraine. It's also the artificial intelligence and the impact on the labor market. It's new household compositions. It's also about whatever changes you have in the production environment in your country. It's a good relations with your neighboring countries. It's trade in Europe. It's trade worldwide. It's all that. It's like the Bologna reform. We call it the Bologna reform. That's when we switched the bachelor and master thing with the professors probably know this with the study points you have. It's a complete ruin from a labor point of view. We actually see in the labor market data that people are now starting 2 years later than they did before the reform. So we have a lot of discussion about raising the pension age from 65 to 67, gaining 2 years that we actually lost because of the education reform at the beginning of the career. So all these things you have to take into account if you talk about the future. And the thing is that future is unknown, and it's a long future. We have to predict what the next, but most pension reforms are, we're now going to make a pension reform that will be sturdy and will help us for the next generations, the next 40, 45 years. Well, that's complete rubbish in my opinion. Unless you're clairvoyant and you have a clear view on how all these elements will evolve in the next 40 years, well, then you can build a pension system. But I would stick to another rule, and that's the +5, -5 rule. At least that's the short-sightedness we have in Belgium. We can look look back thanks to data, 50, 60 years even, and career data in Belgium. But only the last 5 years are, in my opinion, relevant. It's not relevant how people worked that took up their pension 20 years ago and that started working in the 60s, because they're not predictive for what will happen in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years. So you're actually limited to few data on the recent past that probably are relevant for the near future, and you can only predict probably with certain degree of certainty what will happen in the next 5 years. And that leads to a situation where you're actually in constant reform. In Belgium, we actually have it's jokingly, I think it's 1 year, but sometimes it looks like every 6 months we're doing the final reform, or at least the final reform is announced every 6 months. But we're not doing that. We're actually constantly tweaking and changing and adapting the system based on new insights. Well, a lot of times based on ideology, but also when it goes well, when it's actually evidence-based pension policy, then it's on new insights on recent trends on the labor market. And then, of course, you say that this changes now for the long future because new things are happening. And 5 years later, that's already outdated, and you change again, and you change again, and you change again. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's being modest about what you can do with what you know about the future and what you can do with pension policy. But the challenge is trust. And we created the big conundrum in Belgium, like with the whole discussion on the aging and things going to ruin, we created the expectation that actually, people started to believe that a big reform is actually necessary because the country will go to hell if you don't do a pension reform. And on the other hand, people don't want you to do big reforms because that makes them uncertain. They want stability, they want continuity. And so now we have all people are unhappy. Those who want stability are frustrated because every 2 to 3 years we change the legislation in the second pillar again. And those who want the big reforms are frustrated because it's never a big reform, it's always a small reform. So we managed to lose all trust with a lot of galloping horses. It went away in around 2000, I think. So do reforms, but do it piecemeal, be modest, do it based on what you actually know and what you actually can predict. And my fourth lessons learned is don't take too much lessons from other countries.
If we don't take the questions, some of the audience will be disappointed. If we catch the questions and take from the discussion, some of the audience will eat both of us instead of lunch. But somehow, two questions. Trumpi du klausimai. Gal yra žmonių neklaususių dar, atsiprašau.
Atskiras pensijų kontrolės vadintas veiksnys. Pirmas klausimas, man iš dalies jūs jau jį atsakėte, bet man vis tiek įdomu išgirsti, nes tai rezonuoja su tuo, mes susiturime Lietuvoje, dažnos reformas. Pas mus nėra tokios dažnos pusmetį, bet kiekvienoje kadencijoje visą tai yra svarstoma. Tai iš kitos pusės jūs pasakėt labai aiškiai, kad pensijos yra ilgo laikotarpio žaidimas. Tai kaip tą suderinti? Politikai pas jūs ir turbūt dar labiau pas mus nemąsto apie ilgais labai laikotarpiais. Man taip atrodo, kad jie mąsto apie savo kadenciją maksimum. Tai pirmas klausimas yra, koks jūsų patarimas ar kokia patirtis Belgijoje kiek tai įmanoma suderinti. Antras klausimas, girdėt atsakymą, susikurti. Tai mes turim trečią pakopą Lietuvoje ir joje iš esmės jau turim veikiančių schemų, kuomet įmonės, darbdaviai realizuoja profesinės pensijas su tais instrumentais, kurie galimi dabar trečioje pakopoje. Ko trūksta toj trečioje pakopoje? Tai trūksta valdysenos elemento, nėra būdo patiems darbdaviams ir darbuotojų atstovams dalyvauti kažkokiuose sprendimuose ir nėra privalomumo. Tai apie šitų parametrų keitimą turbūt galima būtų kalbėti. Bet kai aš įsiklausiau į tokią detalę analizę, kurią jūs patikėte apie Belgijos sistemą, aš matau ten daugybę sluoksnių ir daugybę kaštų sluoksnių. Tai yra darbdaviai, darbdavių atstovai, konsultantai darbdaviams, profesinės sąjungos, konsultantai profesinėms sąjungoms, konsultantai vyriausybės atstovams, konsultantai pensijų fondų valdytojams, dar įvairiausių. Tikriausiai jūs apie tai ir užsiminėte, kai kalbėjote, su kaštais yra šiokia tokia problema, bent jau su kaštų skaidrumu. Tai ar aš čia labai klystu? Mes turim sistemą, kuri pas mus yra labai paprasta ir primityvi ir galbūt trūksta kai kurių elementų tenai, bet kaštus mes turime gana aiškius, skaidrius ir gana žemus. Tuo tarpu man toks įspūdis, kad jūsų sistema užprogramuoja daugybę kaštų sluoksnių.
Thank you for the questions. I will start with the second question, I think, and then I hope I don't forget the first one. Yeah, I think we have a costly system. We have different kind of costs, of course. There's the investment cost, the management cost, administration cost, all on the side of the pension providers. And I think, if you want the market to be involved, then you should hope for a competitive market that actually works on costs. I think in Belgium, because costs are so obscure and then there was no transparency about it, still isn't, because it's hopefully something that will change by 2026. Well, they were competing on other things. They were competing on, well, my interpretation of this 80% limit allows you to put more money in your second pillar. And my interpretation of certain rules allows you to do more on this part, on that part. So they were competing on the wrong things. And with when I was talking about level playing field with the database, then you actually are saying, oh, stop competing on, some insurers were calling each other, those are cowboys playing in the Wild West, not respecting the rules. We are the more prudent and the more responsible insurer, but they should not be competing on their interpretation of the financial framework or the fiscal framework. They should be competing in who manages, or who does the best investments, who gives the best return. So that's one thing. And there is, of course, that's not included in that cost part, is the big investment employers and employees have to do to be part of the whole system. They co-manage, Paul will talk about it, they actually co-manage pension funds. But then you need, on the employer side and employer unions and on the labor unions, you need a lot of investment via consultant or otherwise in acquiring the necessary knowledge to take that responsibility, because it's nice to ask to be involved, but you also need the competence to be involved. But I think that's related to the other thing, the stability and the change. I think it's an investment that gives you, if you do it well, it's a low price you pay for the trust you can keep in the system, because employers and employees know what is happening. They know the complexity of the system. They reduce their expectations to what is actually doable, and they get perhaps a more realistic view on what it means to have a second pillar and to co-manage a second pillar. And then I would say, of course, I don't have to pay it, so it's easy for me to say, but then I would say that this extra cost of all those consultants around it, perhaps that's a necessary investment you need to do to have involvement of both sides and to feel certain responsibility for the outcome of your system. So it's a cost, but I would say it's a good investment. But that's my opinion. Now, then it comes to the change, and actually there's a link between the two. Of course, you cannot say the next 4 or 5 generations cannot change the pension law anymore because insurers and pension funds need stability. So it's not like we fixed the law or we fixated the law in the 80s and now we cannot touch it anymore. Every generation, every political coalition has the right, if they have another view on how the pension system should evolve, has the right to change it. So you cannot guarantee stability. But that's a link also with what Yves said. The way you introduce the change is something else. You should work, I think, with transition periods. You should work with cohorts. So there is a change, things will change, but not for the immediate future. It will come into full force, let's say, in 5 years, in 10 years. So change will go slow, and that will definitely frustrate the political level. It also will frustrate those who want to change, but it allows all the parties concerned to anticipate it and to prepare for the change. And then again, you need those social partners, if they're also involved, as they are in Belgium, in creating the law. They need to be consulted, we need to ask their advice, and they too can start mentally, they understand why the changes, they don't have to agree, but they're implicated in the flow of the change. The change goes slower, but so you try to combine need for stability and a need for the necessity to change once in a while the legislation. But it's a very difficult balance to find.
Thank you. Question.
Pietus gali palaukti, čia labai svarbus klausimas, mes pasiruošę palaukti. Stevenai, aš esu šiandien nusivylęs ir galvoju, jūs atvažiuosit iš tos tribūnos, išrašysit receptą, kokią sistemą reikia geriausiai būtų galima Lietuvoje. Kuo daugiau klausau, aš matau, mes klykstam iš tikrųjų, bet ačiū už atvirumą, jūs nesat tas šamanas, kurie, atvažiavę sako, aš žinau, kaip reikia, padaryti kokią sistemą. Tai vienas. Antras dalykas, man atrodo, šitoje salėje turėtų daugiau sėdėti sprendimų priėmėjimą. Aš matau, kol kas tik Algirdas Sysa ir ačiū jam už kantrybę. Galbūt mes ir taip, kad sprendimus priima politikai. Čia tas ir ilgalaikiai politikai. Mano klausimas trumpas. Jūs pasakėt vieną pamokymą, gerą tą pamokymą pelgo, bet aš noriu dar vieną pamokymą, kaip sako žydai, ne piniguose laimė, bet gyvėjime juos dauginti. Kaip padauginti pinigus? Jūs tarsi atsakėte receptą. Neužtenka pirmos, antros, tada Marius ir draudimo bendrovės. Mes kalbame apie profesinės pensijas. Ir tada mano klausimas koks būtų. Ar jūs sakėte ne teisininkas, šitas teisininkas, bet neskaičiuotojas. Ar galite pasakyti Belgijos pensijų sistemą, pirma, antra, trečia, ar dar kažkokius pakopus, kiek sugeneruoja procentaliai pensijų? Tai aš žinau, kad Danijoje tai yra pirma pakopa apie 40, antra 30, profesinės pensijos 30. Tai vat kokia yra sistema. Kaip Belgijoje, dėl ko jūs ginčytis? Aš manau, kad šitie skaičiai yra vieni iš svarbiausių, kad mes galėtume įsivaizduoti, kokia kryptimi judėti toliau.
That's the toughest question of all, I think. It's a bit difficult because up until quite recently, nobody actually tried to calculate that in Belgium. Because also, if you talk about pensions in Belgium, you're talking about things that are very difficult to combine. You have this first pillar, which is a pay-as-you-go system. So that's easy to understand. That's a monthly amount, the gross amount, the net amount, it's indexed. And on average, for an employee, because we have 3 schemes, there should be 3 different answers, but for an employee, it will be now a bit above 1,500 euros a month on average. But also in the first pillar, the average hides a lot of the differences. Our first pillar is getting squeezed, however, between a maximum and a minimum that goes up the whole time. So we're moving towards a very limited time of range, because our minimum protections are going up the whole time, and our maximum is not going up with the same speed. So let's say, on average, and this includes everybody, also people who never worked, people who work part-time, people who work only half their lives, people who have been sick all their lives, people who have been unemployed for a big part of their career, people who were briefly in the labor market. If we combine all those kinds of lives, we still get an average of 1,500 euros. And I add all these those elements because it also means that it doesn't mean anything, 1,500, because it's an average between a person that worked 1 week and had an accident at work and never worked again. It also covers the white-collar employee that was in top management since the first day and he worked 35 years. Those two type of careers and all the range between it are behind this 1,500. For the second pillar, it's clear. On average, 10,000 euros, lump sum. The third pillar, and we have very little transparency on the third pillar in Belgium. Third pillar, if you save your whole year, because it's also capped on a fiscal level, you cannot put whatever money you want in it. You get probably about 45,000. I think it's, if I look at my own third pillar, it will be that. So that's what you get in Belgium if you combine the three pillars. But some people don't have a third pillar, don't have a second pillar, and only have the minimum protection in the first pillar. And other people, so the one with the hockey stick point, you get 17 million from the second pillar as an employee. So that's a big range. And that's why it's a very tough question to answer. What do you get out of the pension system in Belgium? Depends very much on which person we're talking about.
Ačiū, pratęsim diskusijas, per pietus mes pratęsim diskusijas ir labai tikiuosi, kad 13:30 didžioji dalis iš jūsų sugrįš, nors tada mes sakė, kad žinot, mes neskubame.